Live from Los Angeles, welcome back to Good Morning LaLa, and I'm really excited for this next conversation because it's incredibly important. We're talking Friday Feels and creating a life that you love. That also means coping, and coping in a healthy way. Kristi Hugstad, the author of Beneath the Surface, is with us, and we're really discussing teens, coping with crisis.
Yeah, you know, our teens today are growing up in such a difficult time. All the different issues that they face, the cyberbullying, the bullying, the self-harm, substance abuse, peer pressure, academic pressure, parental pressure, self-pressure. So they have so many different issues now with technology, and it's a really tough time for them. And that's why the teen suicide, it's epidemic now.
So Kristi, I don't know if you're comfortable talking about your own personal story about what happened with your husband, but tell us a little bit about what brought you to this mission, huge mission you have.
Actually, exactly 7 years ago, my husband completed suicide by train in Dana Point where we lived. And the extra trauma to it is that his father was on the train that he ran in front of. So, you know, I knew that he had to be so mentally ill and have so much major depression to be at that point that he would do something, number one, so violent and so final. So I thought to myself, what am I going to do with this pain? You know, what? I have two choices. I can either be a victim of my pain, or I can make a difference and get out there and do something to help other people so that nobody has to go through that period of darkness and depression that I went through. And that starts by abolishing the stigma of mental illness, because that's what's going on in our culture right now. We are so stigmatized that it's not okay to have depression or any other kind of mental illness, so we don't get help. And that's exactly what happened to my husband. He didn't reach out because he was 54 and this big, strong guy. And I think he felt like, you know, if I reach out, I'm admitting I'm weak, and I wasn't brought up like that. I wasn't brought up as a young boy to show emotions.
Right.
Yeah, so that's why I thought, you know, to get rid of that stigma, we need to start young. And it needs to start with our teens. And we need to normalize conversations. Right?
I just love that point. You know, of course, I struggled with suicidal ideation for a long time. It's why I do the work that I do now. And one of the things I discovered in the process is that, you know, mental health is really a spectrum, and there are degrees, and that we all suffer in some ways with mental illness, even though it might not be considered clinical, because at some point, you know, psychologists and scientists draw a line in the sand and say, this is mental health, and this is mental illness. But really, it's an somewhat arbitrary line, and it's very fuzzy, right? So we all sort of struggle and have had our own experiences with different degrees of mental illness.
Everybody does. That's the part of being human, right? But the important thing is, and that's what I really stress in my book, you need to know what to look for. Like Rob, you said that you struggled with depression. If the people around you were recognizing those signs, like I didn't recognize in my husband, the isolation, the withdrawal, the talk of suicide, the change in sleeping and eating patterns, they were all there waving in front of me. And the risk factors, he had 2 grandmothers who had a suicide attempt. So there's a genetic component too. So that's why I thought, you know what, let's change this culture and let's start raising our kids with the fact that your mental, emotional health should be discussed just like your physical health, and make it okay. So when they are struggling, they'll say, you know what, they'll tell an adult they trust, and they'll say, I need some help.
But how do we really create that safe space, especially for teenagers? Because so many times they don't want not only not to tell, but to tell an adult. So they'll tell other teenagers. There were kids in my high school who committed suicide, and they told other friends, but the friends were too afraid to tell an adult.
And that's exactly what I say in my book. That is not the time to keep a secret, because that person's life is at stake. So even if your friend swears you to secrecy, tell an adult you trust. And another important thing too is I'm big on saying, you know, we need to start the conversation. We need to normalize conversations about mental health. But what I'm finding is, and I'm a credentialed health teacher, right? And when I go to schools and I talk to kids, and to the teachers and the administrators, they're saying, we're so glad you're here because we don't know how to start those conversations. So it's one thing for me to come out and say, we need to talk about this, start the conversations. But what I'm realizing is how.
Exactly.
Right? It's tough, and it's taboo for a lot of people. So at the end of my book, I made questions for each teen issue. So you can sit down with your teens, or teachers can use it as a lesson plan and say, okay, let's open the conversation and let's go over these questions. So I think the important thing is to have follow through, and instead of just saying, let's start that conversation, here's how to do that.
I love that.
No, yeah, I'm just wondering when's the line between just having a conversation versus taking someone and getting them into a facility, because and knowing as a doctor of divinity and realizing the subconscious mind, there's neurological pathways and things that can get so bad that you can't just talk yourself out of depression. Sometimes you need help. You need medical help sometimes.
Well, exactly. And when all those risk factors are there and those warning signs, and it doesn't have to be every single one of them that I list in my book, but when they're at a point where that depression and that darkness doesn't lift for weeks on end, that's a serious issue. And there's a point where you need to ask the most difficult questions, which would be, have you ever thought of taking your life, and do you have a plan?
Yeah.
And
the
at that
action
point,
plan.
right, and at that point, if they do have those ongoing thoughts and they have a plan, that's when you take them in and get them help.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing this light and guidance with us. We really appreciate you.
Yeah.
Please tell everyone where they can find and follow and get more information.
At my website, at thegriefgirl.com.
Yes, love.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Stay
much
tuned
for
back with
having me.
more on Good Morning LaLa.